Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. With us from London is Andrew Roberts, the prolific, popular, and preeminent military historian. Andrew is someone whom a leading critic has called one of the greatest biographers of the English language today. He has written 20 books, including a biography of Napoleon and a best-selling biography of Churchill, said to be the best single biography of Churchill ever written. Among his many works is a comprehensive history of the Second World War. His latest blockbuster, the last of the 20, co-authored with General David Petraeus, is called Conflict: The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. Conflict is a must-read for anyone interested in how warfare has evolved over the last 8 decades, from World War II to what we see today in Gaza. We are pleased to welcome Andrew Roberts to the program. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for doing this, and congratulations on your book, which I absolutely adored. Fascinating insights.
You are kind, Jim. I appreciate it, and it's great to be on the show.
Now, in your prior work, you always seem to be intrigued with world historical individuals, Napoleon, Churchill, George III, the American king. What accounts for this interest?
Well, I'm a believer in the great man and women view of history. I do think that individuals have an important part to play in history.
You also did a BBC series, you remember, on the different leadership styles of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Hitler and Churchill. Is there a common thread as to why they capture the imagination of so many people?
There tends to be a few things, of course, that most great leaders have. Not all, because there are exceptions every time. The ones that you mentioned earlier, except for Adolf Hitler, who obviously his message was of hate and resentment and loathing. The others had a message of hope and progress and the future. The way in which they communicated them, of course, also their oratory was absolutely central. With JFK, Martin Luther King, and Winston Churchill, you had this amazing capacity for uplifting rhetoric. With Hitler, he too was a great orator in his own way. He was extremely hardworking at his oratory. He was somebody who was able to spew out this hate and resentment that I mentioned in a particularly powerful way. So I think that's another very important thing. The communications aspect of leadership is something that I do dwell on a bit in my book, Leadership in War.
Do we have any great orators on the public scene today?
Very few. I heard President Zelensky in the Westminster Hall, and that was an immensely powerful, just as a sheer oratorical exercise. It was tremendously impressive, completely regardless of the very powerful message, of course, that he had to impart. But otherwise, no. I think you almost need to have a wartime, or at least a crisis. Moment in order to bring out the best of oratory, because otherwise it seems slightly overflown almost.
Did Zelensky appear before the House of Lords in battle fatigues?
Yes, yes, he did. He wasn't dressed like the rest of us, but nonetheless, that is how we were hoping and expecting him to dress, needless to say. If he goes to the United Nations in New York dressed like that, we wouldn't have wanted him to have put on a suit and tie for us.
And is that part of the charisma of these world historical individuals, how they dress, how they appear, as well as their passion for oratory?
Very much, no, exactly, and with JFK and Martin Luther King, Winston Churchill, again, people wrote about their charisma almost as soon as they met them. What is different with Adolf Hitler and to an extent Joseph Stalin is the amount of work that their propagandists put into trying to make them charismatic. Hitler wasn't personally charismatic when you met him. But the work that was done by Leni Riefenstahl in the films and Joseph Goebbels with the rallies and others, managed to create out of a pretty unimpressive physical specimen somebody who did have charisma, albeit of an evil kind.
Now, conflict, the evolution of war over 80 years, is your 20th book. Is this the first book you've written with a co-author?
Yes, yes, it was. It was a little bit risky in that sense because I'd never co-authored a book before, and although I knew David, I didn't know whether or not we would get on as sort of, intellectual partners, as it were. But luckily, it was a tremendously stimulating exercise. I was helped by the fact, or at least should I say, reassured by the fact that he had a PhD in international affairs at Princeton. So, and I already knew that he was sort of considered a soldier scholar. So I wasn't too worried on that score.
So how did this partnership arise? Did you get onto him, or did he get onto you?
I got onto him very soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I phoned him and said, look, there are going to be lots of books about the geopolitical and the political history and background of this war. But why don't we write one just about the military history aspect of it and put it in the context of previous wars since 1945? And he jumped at the chance. This was the first book that he's written between hardcovers. And he had a lot to say, as you can imagine. When we were asked by the publishers how we were going to divvy up the chapters, I said, well, David's going to write about all the wars and places that he's invaded, and I'll do the rest. He also did the Vietnam chapter. So all in all, we then sent back each other's chapters to each other, and the result was ultimately what was published.
Now, essentially, what was your basic argument in the book? Warfare has evolved in part because of advances in technology, but what is it that you were really saying as you threw the rock over the pond?
What we were saying really was that the key factor in victory or defeat in warfare is not the number of troops you have or the equipment that you're fighting with, or whether or not you control the main cities or fortresses or so on, but actually strategic leadership. And by that, we meant that the general or the civic leader, military civil relations, the person who was making ultimately the decision about how the war was going to be fought, had to get the big idea right. And that done, he or she then had to work down the organization and make sure that everybody understood that across the length and breadth of the organization, and then had to implement it and implement it forcefully. And then, crucially, had to adapt it, constantly change it, because as we know, no plan survives contact with the enemy. So it needed to be continually adapted again and again and again.
So the big idea is what military people call the strategy?
Precisely, yes. What the war looked like, and the best way to fight it, essentially. So if you get the big idea wrong, like Chiang Kai-shek did, for example, in the Chinese Civil War, trying to hold on to cities rather than engage the communists wherever he found them, then it doesn't matter that he started off with 4 or 5 times the number of men, started off with all the cities, started off with the captured Japanese equipment. He still lost. Whereas you have various generals, and we go through them in the book, who are able to win despite not starting with any of these advantages if they get the big ideas right at the beginning. This is not, I want to make it very clear, this is not a comprehensive history of all the 140 or so major wars since 1945. It's very much, we look at the 24 or so wars that we think are a key to understanding the evolution of warfare. Some of them are paradigm shifting wars, like Yom Kippur or Ukraine, and others show that there is no sort of linear progression of the evolution of warfare.
Now, the war in Gaza erupted after the publication of your book, and you don't treat it there. But what do you see as the big idea for Israel and Gaza?
Yes, you're quite right. It broke out whilst we were actually publicizing the book, but we do go into wars that are, if not exactly the same as Gaza, because there's nothing that's exactly the same as Gaza post 1945. There are various um, urban contests and um, urban fighting of the kind that one saw in Fallujah and Najaf and Mosul that has a kind of equivalence. But actually, you really have to go back, I think, to the Second World War, to the fighting in Monte Cassino and Stalingrad, to appreciate what it's like going from room to room, cellar to cellar, trying to, in this case, extirpate Hamas. And of course, in both of those examples, and indeed in the three previous ones I mentioned, you don't have a tunnel system whereby the enemy can come up behind you. And that also requires, obviously, an enormous amount of input in terms of men. So there isn't. David and I racked our brains actually after the 7th of October, and we couldn't find a direct parallel with the incredibly difficult, fiendishly difficult operation that the IDF have to undergo in Gaza.
Now, for the moment, the war in Gaza seems to have morphed from retaliation for a terrorist attack, a surprise terrorist attack, a dastardly one, into a hostage crisis. And during the hostage crisis, there is a lull in the fighting. So what do you make of all that?
Well, it's the triumph, I suppose, of politics over military strategy. The IDF had built up a pretty impressive momentum in northern Gaza. It was going to then move on to, and since will now move on to southern Gaza. The time has been used clearly by Hamas to regroup and probably set up even more horrific ambushes and IEDs and so on. But nonetheless, it did allow a brief respite for the some 81 hostages to be released. So that in itself, of course, has to be a good thing.
But of course, this is only a fraction of the hostages that were taken. We don't even know how many are alive and how many are held by Hamas or how many are held by other elements within Gaza, other terrorist elements. The question is, I mean, there were supposedly 300 Israeli hostages, and if you compare it to the U.S. population at 9/11, it's as though they took 5,000 hostages in the United States. And it's a very tall order for Israel with its concern for individual lives to try to do something about it.
I think that's right, and I think it's also important to put that in the kind of American perspective that one does, and also, of course, the numbers killed. You have to also multiply that by the huge disparity between the Israeli and American populations, and recognize that were it to have happened to America, it would be like 40 or so 9/11s. And it strikes me that there is nothing that any American president would not do in order to destroy the military basis of whoever it was that killed that many Americans. So I think one has to, when looking at the decisions, the very, very difficult decisions that Bibi Netanyahu and his war cabinet have to take over the next weeks and months, really to try and put ourselves in their position to recognize that this is a thing that they did not want and which they're doing their best to deal with. But if we were in their position, we would probably be doing exactly the same thing.
So that if Hamas were, God forbid, in Mexico and they committed similar acts invading Texas and crossed the Rio Grande and killed 40,000 Americans and took some 5,000 hostages. I mean, what do you suppose the American response would be? Wouldn't it be something similar to what Israel is doing?
Of course, it would be all-out war, and although, of course, the American army would attempt to protect innocent civilians as much as possible, so too do the IDF do that at the moment. The terrible attacks that are being made in the Western media on the Israeli army, which is one of the best armies in the world when it comes to ethical fighting, I think are monstrous, frankly. And yeah, it's a appalling situation, but it is not a situation created by the IDF, and they are the people who can actually, hopefully, end it by winning.
Well, there's also an information war going on. And as you say, the media have portrayed the Israeli army in a very different way from what seems to be the fact. And as the old saying goes, the truth is lacing up its shoes while the lie goes around the world 3 times. Question is time running out for the Israelis? Is world opinion losing any backing for what the Israelis are doing?
Well, I'm very pleased you mentioned the information side of things because in chapter 10 of our book, which is about the future of war, we go into information, misinformation, and disinformation. And of course, you see an awful lot of that, as you say, here in the Gazan situation. The classic example, of course, being the accusation that the Israelis killed 500 people in a hospital in Gaza with a rocket. And it turned out, of course, to have been Islamic Jihad that killed about 50 people with a rocket that fell short and hit the hospital. That is classic example of disinformation, which goes around the world, as you say, much faster. In fact, there's been an MIT study that showed that a lie is 7 times more likely to be retweeted or sent around TikTok than something that's true. Now, I don't know what that says about human nature, but whatever it does say is that in warfare, it is very important to be on the side of the truth, of course, but also to be able to get that truth out as successfully as possible.
You mentioned Bibi Netanyahu. Is he the kind of strategic leader that you see in Zelensky and in the other figures you've written about, Napoleon, Churchill, and so on?
Yes, he certainly knows a good deal about war. You know, he's been on the sharp end himself. He's also, of course, been around in Middle Eastern politics for a very long time. He has a true appreciation of what the IDF is capable of. He was forced. He's already been forced, I think, into various uncomfortable positions. He seems to be very widely loathed in much of the Western media. But the lucky thing about him is that he has a sort of moral courage, a core that doesn't get worried about that kind of thing. If he thinks something is right, and in this case, we're talking about the extirpation of Hamas as a military force. He's not going to be able to destroy it around the world as a political force, obviously, but as a military force that can attack Israel. I don't think he's going to care what the rest of us say or think. He's going to do what he thinks is right.
Well, of course, he was caught napping and didn't protect his people against the surprise attack. Is he vulnerable there?
Politically, obviously, so after the war's over, perhaps even earlier than that. But I think it's very important to remember that surprise attacks happen so often in history that, as Paul Wolfowitz said, the surprising thing is that we're still surprised by them. They happened in the 40s at Pearl Harbor, the 50s with the attack across the parallel in Korea, the 60s in the Six-Day War, the 70s in the Yom Kippur War, the 80s in the Falklands, the 90s in Kuwait. You had it, of course, in 9/11 as well, and now this. You know, there are a lot of surprises that happen. Some of them are intelligence failures. Others are just very, very well organized attacks by the enemy. And so I think it does need to be seen in historical context, this idea that, as you say, the Israelis were caught napping.
Now, Clausewitz, of course, famously said that war is an extension of politics, and there has to be, one would think, a political component in the morning after. So after Israel has fulfilled its mission and it's extirpated and eliminated Hamas as a threat, then what happens to the rubble of Gaza and the people who live there? And what about the two-state solution? Is there any sign that there's a political component to Israel's strategy?
Well, this is one of the things that we go into in our book quite a lot, is the importance of the political strategy, how it was instrumental in helping win the Malayan insurgency in Malaya in the 1950s, the Darfur uprising in Oman in the 1960s and early 70s, and in many other areas of conflict since 1945. You have a positive message, something that the people can look forward to, something that's there's a sort of modern alternative that is going to be better than what you've got at the moment, and that would presumably involve a two-state solution, but just so long as the state, the Arab-Palestinian state that's created, is not going to be dominated by people who are going to ensure that warfare will continue. The worrying thing is that you're going to continue to have, as is the case in the West Bank as well as Gaza, an education system where 8-year-old children are taught that it's a good thing to kill Jews. If you have that, that turns into a generational conflict. And so it's not just a political solution. I think it needs to be an educational one as well. Fortunately, there are 22 Arab countries in the world. They are fantastically rich, far richer than Israel. And if they step up, and if the United Nations steps up, the Arab League and so on, then there could be the money present to rebuild Gaza. But it's got to be a much better Gaza than it was than the Hamas one that we had before.
Well, is it possible for Israel to negotiate with Hamas when Hamas is dedicated to Israel's extinction? It seems to be...
No, it's completely impossible to negotiate with. Completely impossible. But it is possible to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. I mean, Israel has been doing that for some time now, and after the events of the 7th of October, it is clear that Hamas is not a normal government in any sense. It's a government that's willing to use its people in a way that no other government in the world will do, because it places the killing of as many Jews as possible at the absolute top of its agenda, far more than taking care of its own people.
What about the bystanders, Russia and Iran? Certainly Putin profited from the distraction of the United States of the situation in Gaza, because it took our attention away from Ukraine. And you might talk about what's going on there. And also Iran, which certainly seems to enjoy Israel's discomfort.
Well, not just enjoy. I mean, although there hasn't been a direct link made so far, it clearly completely supports everything that Hamas, which it finances, has done. So in that sense, yes, I think Iran needs to be seen as a profoundly malign actor in the region.
So I have a question for you, Lord Andrew Roberts, and my question is, how do you see principally that warfare has evolved over the last 80 years?
Well, the fact is that it has the capacity to be the evolution of warfare to be sidetracked. We saw that in the Iran-Iraq war, of course, where over 8 years nearly 2 million people died, and they had trenches and barbed wire and gas and essentially the same kind of fighting as in the First World War. And then in other wars like the Yom Kippur War and now in Ukraine, you see you see engagements that essentially are paradigm shifts, moving the concept of warfare forward. David Petraeus and I visited Kyiv and talked to a large number of generals and ministers about 6 months ago. And we were hugely impressed by the innovation that the Ukrainians had used since the invasion, the way in which they have essentially been fighting a digital war when the Russians have been fighting an analog one. The use of drones, the way in which iPhones can draw down artillery fire on that great long tank column outside Kyiv that you'll remember at the end of last year. You know, the way in which technology is being connected. This is why we did this last chapter 10, also, which is about cyber and space and AI, robotics and drones and so on. The horrifying fact is that war is, of course, evolving faster now than it ever has at any period since 1945.
Well, unfortunately, we have to stop. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Lord Andrew Roberts, for coming by. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Meanwhile, be well, take care, and all the best.